that the wise men had outwitted him. He sent soldiers to kill all the boys in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old and under, based on the wise men's report of the star's first appearance. Herod's brutal action fulfilled what God had spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. A cry was heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning. Rachel weeps for her children, refusing to be comforted, for they are dead.
And the kids are dismissed for shy time. Yes.
Before the youth release, can I make an announcement? It's a good announcement. As some of you know, the youth and some of us is going to go to Winter Fest in February. So somebody come up with the idea of baking cookies. In a couple of weeks, we did 140 cookie trays, 3,312 cookies, and 66 pounds of fudge. They raised $1,400 between them for them to be able to go to the fest. So hopefully next year, if we left any evidence out, we didn't need to. We just kind of didn't get to this in time. And when they hit me with it 2 weeks ago, I said, we can do this. We did. I'm tired, they're tired, but we had a good time. So thank you, kids, and thank you for the ones that bought. And maybe next year we'll start earlier, and you can buy a tray if you want to. Thank you.
Good morning, Eastside.
Good morning.
Grace and peace from God the Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. And Merry Christmas. I'm going to depart from a personal tradition. You guys wouldn't know this if I didn't tell you, but I wanted to use that to kind of preface the lesson. Typically and historically, I don't preach Christmas sermons. In fact, typically and historically, I don't preach holiday themes or special occasion themed sermons at all. I'm like Denny's. I'm always open for whatever sermon series I've got going on. So I usually just plod on through whatever it is we're preaching about and let that be that. But in my reading over the past week or so, am I on back to back? I am on? Okay. In my reading over the past week or so, actually over the past probably 2 or 3 weeks, my heart has been gripped by a particular story that is associated with the birth narrative of Jesus of Nazareth. And so I wanted to plunge more deeply into that. Number one, for my own personal benefit, I simply wanted to know what to do with this text. And then number two, to share that with you all. So perhaps you might know what to do with this text. An important text of itself, but a very troubling passage of Scripture. There is a story which Isaac just read to us, which is intimately and yet painfully connected to the story of Jesus' coming into our world, which I believe our eyes, when we read that story, are accustomed to quickly passing over. I think our eyes are accustomed to passing quickly over that part of the story because it's a disturbing story. It's a brutal story. It's not a pleasant thing to read about. That's likely why we hurry past it in our reading. That's likely why we don't think about it too much, and why we certainly don't talk about it very much when it comes time to look into the birth story of Jesus Christ. And yet it is still there, begging to be read, begging for us to ponder it, for us to remember it. There it is, crying out to us for an explanation, crying for some type of an interpretation, maybe even crying out for someone just to weep with the victims that it describes. Is there any solace for Rachel when she weeps over her children on the day that Bethlehem's babies are killed? Is there anyone brave and bold enough who will sit there with those babyless mothers in Bethlehem and grieve grieve with them. And is there anybody bold enough to beg God for an explanation, for an answer as to why he let that happen? 2,000 years ago, there was excitement that had been stirred in Jerusalem at the news that some out-of-towners had come in asking about a new king of the Jews. And those outsiders were very clearly respectable and wealthy men based upon how they were dressed and based upon the goods that they were carrying with them. So it was very likely that they weren't making this stuff up. It was likely that they weren't making up the idea that some new king had been born for the Jews. But as of yet, nobody had heard about it. And so their questions only fueled rumor and speculation within the city. Eventually, the rumors were so great that the actual king of the Jews, Herod, heard about it. And as you can imagine, he was greatly alarmed. He was the king. And he also knew that no one was going to be the king after him except someone from his own line. So who was this new king? Who's making these claims? Surely, if they were making these claims and he didn't know about it, they had to be his enemies. And maybe they even had plans at that very moment to usurp his kingship by rebellion, maybe even by assassination. And so obviously this was a problem that needed to be dealt with. And that problem, Herod would have no trouble in dealing with, because he was expert at dealing with problems like this. Notoriously paranoid, Herod had never hesitated to kill anybody who ever threatened his reign. For instance, because of what he perceived to be their hostility towards him and their desire for his throne, Herod had 3 of his own sons executed during the span of his reign. Alexander and Aristobulus he had strangled for what he thought were treacherous schemes against him. Antipater he had executed while in his own dungeon. Moreover, when he became suspicious of his favorite wife's political loyalty, by the way, he had 10, but he had a favorite. But when he became suspicious of his favorite wife's political loyalty, he had her killed too, although it later came to light that she actually wasn't guilty of what he suspected that she was. And history would even go on to record about Herod that in order to ensure that the nation of Israel would indeed mourn when he died, because he knew they wouldn't be sad over his death, he wasn't that type of ruler. But in order to ensure that there would be mourning in Israel when he died, he gave orders that upon news of his death, the nobles of Israel were to be gathered together along with one member out of every family in the country. And once it was known that he died, they were all to be executed. But the intent there was that if Israel was not going to mourn his death, he wanted somebody to be mourning something. He wanted mourning and sorrow to at least characterize the day that he died. And so he gave orders to kill one member out of every household. Thankfully, those orders were disobeyed once he died. So unsurprisingly, when he heard that a new king had been born, he recruits these 3 wise men from the east to find the child and to come back and to tell him where this child is located. He claimed that he wanted to worship the child, but of course that was a lie. He simply wanted to have him killed. But thankfully, the wise men in a dream discerned that Herod's intentions were evil, and so after they met with the child and gave the child their gifts, they returned home by a different route. Also warned in a dream, by the way, was the family of the baby Jesus. Joseph, the father who seemed to be the father of Jesus, but who wasn't actually, was warned in a dream that Herod intended to seek out his child and have him destroyed. So they uprooted themselves from Bethlehem and they fled down to Egypt, there to stay until Herod was dead. But after a reasonable amount of time of waiting on the wise men to return, Herod figured out that they had obviously tricked him. And so he decided to concoct a ruthless plan to ensure that this so-called baby king would not escape. So he orders his soldiers to Bethlehem and the surrounding region. And once they arrived, they had one mission and one mission only: kill every male child 2 years old and younger. Now, Bethlehem and its surrounding region weren't large by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, even the prophecy about the Messiah's coming made mention of the fact that Bethlehem was too little to be among the clans of Judah. That's in Micah 5:2. And so the number of children who actually fit Herod's criteria likely wasn't very large. By most estimates, probably between 15 and 20 kids. But friends, if it's your family member, if it's your friend, if it's your baby that's been killed, it usually doesn't take dozens and dozens of more deaths to make that pain and loss so very real to you. Just the loss of your loved one, just the loss of your friend, just the loss of your child is more than enough to drive daggers of hurt through your heart. So what was about to happen in Bethlehem was destined to be catastrophically life-changing for the lives of those people who were about to experience it. And because Bethlehem was so small, because it was so quaint, and because the people there were so accustomed to living quiet, peaceful lives, they were completely unprepared for what happened when Herod's soldiers arrived. No doubt they heard the thunder of the horses' hooves on the ground. No doubt they saw the squad of soldiers gathering. Maybe they even heard the shout of the orders through the air. But the reality, the stone-cold reality of what was happening probably didn't hit them until they saw the first toddler impaled by a spear. And what was he doing moments before that, I wondered? Was he playing in the street with his sisters? Was he chasing the family cat along an alleyway? Was he eating a snack like my 2-year-old likes to do? We don't know exactly what that first child was doing. We can imagine that he was probably doing something that a lot of 2-year-olds like to do just before his violent, brutal death came. One moment there was normalcy, and the next moment there was violent death and worlds turned upside down. And that's probably when the screaming started. Panic-stricken mothers start to hurriedly reach for their children. Brave and duty-bound fathers start looking for something to use as a weapon. People start running indoors, hiding, praying that God won't let that happen to their baby. But the soldiers keep coming. And after a while, it becomes obvious that they're targeting a specific group of boys because not every child is killed, and the adults are not openly targeted. But even so, it's still hard to hold off trained and equipped killers with just a rake or a stool or a heavy rock. And as such, fathers inevitably failed to defend their sons. Maybe some of those fathers even died while trying to protect their boys. Maybe other fathers are simply overwhelmed by the group of soldiers and held down like one other soldier goes over to his little boy and performs that heinous crime. Maybe some of them hurl themselves in desperation at those soldiers, attacking, clawing, biting, hitting with only their bare hands, and maybe they lost some of those hands under the strike of a sword. But even when the soldiers finally did muscle past the defense of the fathers, they still had to go through those mothers. Oh, those mothers. What can possibly the grip of a mother who's driven by every ounce of natural instinct, every fiber of motherly love to protect her sons. When a baby's life is threatened, the arms of mommies can become like a band of 1,000 pieces of iron around their child. So I dare say that nothing could have broken the protective grip of the Bethlehem mothers that day, which is probably why some of those mothers died. It's probably why some of those mothers were permanently maimed and crippled, as the soldiers literally had to cut them off of their sons. So when the savage ordeal was finally done, all you could hear in Bethlehem and the surrounding area that night would have been the deep, anguished cries of mothers, fathers, and sisters, and brothers, mourning the fact that their little brother is dead, mourning the fact that their little boy is dead, maybe mourning the fact that their spouse is now dead too, because they tried to protect the boy. And it's that anguish that Matthew, the story's author, identifies with the anguish of one of Israel's most favored matriarchs, Rachel. In Jeremiah 31:15, Rachel is poetically described as mourning for the capture and exile of her descendants by invading forces. And as those descendants were marched northward, she's described as weeping from her grave, refusing to be comforted because of the loss of her people as a nation, because her children were no more. But now in Bethlehem, she's weeping again. She's refusing to be comforted again because of this new, horrendous act that has been once more perpetrated against her children. So did the occupants of Bethlehem know that their little town housed the Messiah shortly before that time? Did they have any idea that this was why Herod sent his slaughter squad to visit on that faithful day? And did they know that the Holy Child had actually escaped completely unharmed? We don't have answers to those questions. But we can certainly imagine some other questions that they had in their minds. Questions like, why us? Questions like, why our kids? What did we do to deserve this? This isn't supposed to happen to people who are in covenant with God. If it does, then what good is God? If He can't protect us, or if He won't protect us, why worship Him? Why even believe? And if they knew that the Messiah had been there, which they probably did, at least some of them, because of the unusual visitors over the previous few days. If they did, then the questions just become more hard. Where did He go after that day? And why didn't He ever come back? Why didn't He come back to tell us why we had to go through that? Why didn't He come back and give us an explanation? Why didn't He come back and apologize for the fact that we had to lose our boys for Him? What's He going to give us in the place of our sons? All of those were valid questions, by the way. They weren't out of bounds. They weren't unlawful. They were born out of genuine human emotion, stirred by a genuine human tragedy. And maybe the worst thing of all was they didn't know how the story ended. And isn't that what contributes so much to some of our despair and the dark moments of our lives? We don't know how the story is going to end. So faith is hard to come by. Confidence and trust is hard to come by. Well, at least in this instance, you and I as readers have an advantage. At least we can see how the story ends and how Matthew connects what happens here to a larger storyline. A storyline which may in fact let just a little bit of light into this thick darkness in Bethlehem. Matthew gives us a clue as to how the story ends by quoting from Jeremiah. When any New Testament author quotes an Old Testament author, that author is assuming the context of the entire original statement. To put it differently, the New Testament author is assuming that his readers know their Old Testaments well enough to understand not just the reference itself, but also the context of that reference. So he'll then select the part of the passage which most illustrates the point to be made, while still intending the entire context of that passage to apply. So the interesting thing about the quote from Jeremiah 31 is that the entire chapter is a chapter of joy. It's a chapter spilling over with confidence that God is going to take the mournful circumstances of Jewish exile and turn them into occasions for incredible gladness. Just to illustrate, listen to the first 4 verses before Jeremiah 31:15. This is what God says, "For the Lord has ransomed Jacob and has redeemed him from hands too strong for him. They shall come and sing aloud on the height of Zion, and they shall be radiant over the goodness of the Lord, over the grain, the wine, and the oil, and over the young of the flock and the herd. For their life shall be like a watered garden, and they shall languish no more. Then the young women will rejoice in the dance, and the young men and the old shall be merry. I will turn their mourning into joy. I will comfort them and give them gladness for sorrow. I will feast the soul of the priest with abundance, and my people shall be satisfied with my goodness, declares the Lord." That's the first 4 verses before he starts talking about the weeping of Rachel over her children. That doesn't sound like weeping. That doesn't sound like anguish. And did you catch the key phrase in there? I will turn their mourning into joy. So when Jeremiah is writing about Rachel weeping for her children, just in the next verse, how does the Lord intend to take her mourning and turn it into joy? Well, listen to the 2 verses after verse 15. There Jeremiah writes, "Thus says the Lord, keep your voice from weeping and your eyes from tears. For there is a reward for your work, declares the Lord. And they shall come back from the land of the enemy. There is hope for your future, declares the Lord, and your children shall come back to their own country." Now, did you catch that last line? There is hope for your future, declares the Lord, and your children shall come back to their own country. So now the question takes a bit of a turn. How does that context inform Matthew's quotation in the story of the killing of Bethlehem's babies? And how does the story of Jesus Christ and those murdered infants fulfill or complete that context? Well, there's a number of ways that have been suggested. For instance, was Matthew connecting Jesus' life with the national life of Israel to show that Israel, God's adopted and firstborn son, had been consistently disobedient and disloyal, which warranted an exile. But that a true son of God, namely Jesus, would always be faithful regardless of any sin-caused obstacles in his life. Or maybe Matthew was using the Jeremiah quotation, coming as it did from a context of joy because of God's promise to end the exile, to correlate the Jewish exile and return with Jesus' exile and return, in order to show that by Jesus' return, exile for everybody was being permanently ended. Maybe that was it. Or maybe Matthew was just showing Jesus as the true and greater Moses, whose infancy, by the way, was also punctuated by a decree to kill Hebrew babies. But Jesus, being a son and not a servant like Moses, came to give a law of love that completely and decisively deals with sin, and which happens to surpass the law of ritual and regulation which Moses gave. Maybe that's it. Well, without question, all of those are true from a theological perspective. From the standpoint of redemptive history, God is doing every single one of those things in the birth story of Jesus. But the question is, where is the payoff? Where is the emotional comfort in all of that for the parents grieving in Bethlehem that day? Where's the joy of the Messiah returning from his own exile and coming back to his people? How did his survival on that day bring peace and justice to those sorrowing mothers and fathers? Where's the assurance that a greater lawgiver is here and that somehow this makes our grief better? That somehow this makes it okay that our toddler son has been hacked to death with a sword? Well, those theological answers don't address that part of the equation. Those theological answers don't soothe the hearts of parents that have been ripped open and having to bury their babies after a brutal, violent death. So we're still left asking, God, how are you going to turn this mourning into joy? Well, maybe if we keep reading in Jeremiah 31, an answer will start to form. As we draw near to the end of that chapter, we come upon verses 31 and 34. And this is what they say. Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day that I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. And on it goes. As it turns out, Jeremiah 31 is the famous chapter in the Old Testament that talks about God establishing a new covenant. It's a covenant in which all sin is going to be remembered no more. It's a covenant in which God's law will be inscribed on the tablets of human hearts instead of on tablets of stone. And in fact, this passage was so influential to early Christians that it shows up twice in the book of Hebrews, and its language even finds its way onto the lips of Jesus towards the close of Jesus' life. Maybe you'll remember that in the end of Matthew's story about Jesus, Jesus institutes a supper by which he is to be remembered so long as he has disciples in the world. We partook of that supper a few moments ago. And when describing that emblem, which was meant to symbolize the blood that was going to be poured out for the sins of humanity, this is what he says. He says, drink of it, all of you, for this is my blood of the new covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. Now, what is he pointing to there? Where is this blood going to be shed? Where is this forgiveness going to emanate from? Well, if you keep going with Matthew's story of Jesus, you're going to find that this blood and this forgiveness was secured on the cross of Christ, where Jesus was given to die. That was where God laid on Jesus the iniquity of us all. That's where, according to Isaiah, he was pierced for our transgressions, where he was crushed for our iniquities, where God inflicted him with the chastisement, the punishment that brought us peace, and where God, by his wounds, heals us. So now with that in mind, look at the shocking reversal that we see here. Between the beginning of Jesus' story and the end of it, in the early stages of Jesus' story, it's God's Son who lives and everybody else's son dies. But by the end of the story, it's God's Son who dies and everybody else gets to live. So what does that say to us? What does that say to the grieving mothers and fathers in Bethlehem that day who rightly believed in the Messiah and what the Old Testament had to say about him? What does that say to grieving fathers and mothers right now in this time? Maybe it's this. Maybe this passage just tells us that God knows how ugly, how messy, and how tragic this world has become because of sin. Maybe it tells us that God knows that this sin-saturated world can be an incredibly dark place, especially when parents have to bury their babies due to extreme and abhorrent violence. Maybe this passage is telling us that God knows this, and he knows it more than most of us do by his Son, Jesus. Maybe it tells us that he's willing to enter into it with us. And at the same time, by giving us this specific look into the life of Jesus, he's showing us that the answer isn't simply to shield and insulate his people from all of the harm and all of the pain that this world has to offer while the rest of the world burns. In fact, I think this passage is telling us that God refuses to shield us from most of it, at least large portions of it. And that awareness instantly reframes all of those great promises that have given you and me strength and hope over the years with respect to God's blessings and God's protection so long as we do his will. This passage reframes those promises. It reframes those promises to declare that they're not intended as assurances that will always be shielded from the hurt and the suffering and even the brutality of life. They're not promises that assure us that we will always be exempt from the tragedies. Rather, they're promises that God will simply walk with us in them. And in the walking, that he will give us hope for the future. Now, I admit right away, that's no easy consolation. That's not an immediate gratification to our grief. It's not some cheap, sentimental comfort. But I'm persuaded that that's exactly what's illustrated in the massacre at Bethlehem and the death of Jesus. God will not always, nor will he necessarily shield us from harm and all sorts of horrible acts in our lives. He won't necessarily stop and prevent all evil and all suffering, even towards his people. But what he will do is work in it. What he will do is redeem it and infuse it with hope. And he does that by leading us, rather he does it not by leading us around all despair and all anguish, but by leading us through the despair and the anguish. He doesn't help us escape the harshness of our sin-stained world. He enters into it with us. Because that's really the only way to eliminate evil and all of its grotesque consequences. You've got to get your hands dirty. You've got to work from within, not from the outside. And so God enters into the fray, not to protect us from every blow that evil throws at us, but to take those blows right at our side until, just when it looks like evil is winning, God himself rises up to deliver the death blow. So that's what the story of Rachel weeping over the Bethlehem children has to say to us today. It tells us that this world is dark and cruel. That humanity's potential for great evil is absolutely horrifying. And that God's people, or even people who are generally innocent, will not be spared these realities. But at the same time, it tells us that God will walk with us through them, eventually redeeming them for us and showing us his glory in ways which were to us previously unimaginable and unthinkable. And he does that first and foremost through his Son, who escaped one death when everybody else around him died, but who later walked straight ahead into a pre-planned death so that everybody around him could live. And then, through his resurrection from the dead, he secured the greatest future imaginable, the greatest hope imaginable for all who follow him in a faithful and obedient life, thereby ensuring that death does not have the final victory in spite of how rudely and in spite of how tragically it may intrude into our lives. So this passage is speaking of a long consolation. A comfort that has to be waited upon. Not some sentimental solace with a quick, glib explanation. This is a long consolation in the hope that only Jesus provides. And that's God's answer in Bethlehem. And that's God's power for salvation.
So if you're interested today in that comfort and that salvation and that companionship through suffering and tragedy, we invite you to embrace the Savior that provides it all by trusting in Him, turning from your sin, and being baptized, and being His light in the incredibly dark places. We give you that chance right now as we stand together and sing.
We've got a small package in the back for you, completely free. Take one. Also, don't forget, we are having lunch served immediately after our worship this morning. So hang out and enjoy our company. And finally, Merry Christmas, Eastside. I hope that you have a blessed holiday with your family. I hope that you are safe in travels. And we look forward to seeing you back here next week.
We're going to go ahead and have a seat, please.